So, before Martin Luther, before that huge rupture we now call the Reformation, the church in Western Europe, well, it was everything. I mean, it was the single, massive, and what seems like a totally unshakable institution. It ran your life from the moment you were born to the moment you were buried. But underneath that unified surface, the world was on the edge of a massive change. And the clues for that change, they pop up in the most unexpected places, like a really weird carving in a tiny English church. Okay, so check this out. In the little village of Preston Bissett, carved right into the arch leading to the holiest part of the church, you've got this guy. He was carved way back in the 14th century, and he's crouching there, showing his bare backside directly at the high altar. The very spot where the miracle of the Mass was supposed to happen. So what's the deal? Was this just some crude joke? Maybe a little warning to a lazy priest that, hey, people are watching? Or was it something a lot more sinister? Maybe this was a symbol of Satan himself, mooning the most sacred act in all of Christendom. A constant, in-your-face reminder of the spiritual war that was being fought right there in that very building. Honestly, we can't be 100% sure. But this one little carving, it just cracks open a door into a whole lost world. A world where the physical and the spiritual were all tangled up in ways that to us can seem pretty bizarre. To really get why the Reformation even happened, we have to try and step inside this lost world of belief. This was a place where heaven and hell weren't just some abstract ideas you'd think about. Oh no, they were vivid, they were terrifyingly real, and they were literally painted all over the walls of your local church. Just imagine you're a regular person standing in your church. You'd look up and see things like the Doom painting. And this wasn't just some nice artwork. It was like a window into what happens after you die. You'd see Christ on his giant rude cross, and right behind him, this massive mural of the Last Judgment. You'd see the naked souls of the dead getting sorted. Some are marching off to heaven, and the others, they're being dragged by demons into the fiery mouth of hell. It made the stakes of your own life feel incredibly real and incredibly high. So how did this whole massive system stay standing? Well, years later, an English bishop named Nicholas Ridley was waiting to be executed for heresy, and he was thinking back on the old church. He said it all stood on two mighty pillars. First, the doctrine of the Mass, which decided the fate of your soul, and second, the power of the Pope, who ran the whole show on earth. So let's use his idea and take a look at each of those pillars. All right, let's start with pillar number 1, the Mass. This was way more than just a church service. It was the absolute engine of the entire spiritual economy. It was the central ritual where, people believed, bread and wine literally became the body and blood of Christ. And its power reached way beyond the church walls. In fact, it reached beyond the grave. And you really felt the power of the Mass in its connection to the idea of purgatory. See, the Bible talks about heaven and hell, but that's a pretty stark choice, right? Most people aren't total saints or pure evil. We're somewhere in the middle. Purgatory was the answer to that. It was a place where good souls went to get cleansed of all their smaller sins before they could get into heaven. But here's the crucial part. Your time there wasn't a fixed sentence. And that little detail created a whole bustling spiritual economy. The living could actually help out the dead by praying for them, or funding special masses, or even buying things called indulgences. You could literally knock years off a loved one's time in purgatory. It was this whole system of mutual aid between our world and the next, a kind of industry of prayer, where your actions had real, measurable results. So just how measurable are we talking? Well, there was this popular set of prayers called the 15 O's of St. Bridget. It promised that if you recited these specific prayers every single day for a year, you would earn, get this, 5,475 years off your time in purgatory. This wasn't just some vague hope. This was spiritual math. Salvation was something you could actually work for and add up. But here's a really interesting wrinkle. This obsession with doing things to earn salvation was way more intense in Northern Europe. In places like Germany and England, religion was all about action, piling up good deeds, prayers, and penance. But down in Italy and Spain, the focus was more on the priest's role as the mediator of God's grace. This difference is so key because it helps explain why Martin Luther's message, which basically blew up this whole idea of earning salvation, later found such a ready audience in the North. Okay, so that was the spiritual pillar. Now let's talk about the second, institutional pillar holding this whole world up, the papacy. This is where all the money from that spiritual economy, all those masses and indulgences, got turned into incredible institutional power. If the mass was the engine, then the papacy was the giant international corporation running the whole operation. You can almost think of the clergy as this huge Europe-wide trade union. Seriously, they were a professional class, they could all read and write, they were celibate, and they were set completely apart from everybody else. And this organization had its own laws, its own court system, and its own bureaucracy that stretched all the way from Rome down to the tiniest village church. And you can really see the machinery of that power here. You see how all the pieces fit together. You've got the Pope at the top, the ultimate authority. His power was enforced through a universal legal system called canon law, and it was carried out across Europe by big international orders of monks. And the key to it all, the clergy controlled the information technology of the day, writing. It was a perfect self-reinforcing system of power. But this incredibly powerful, centuries-old institution wasn't nearly as solid as it looked, not by a long shot. The foundations were cracking. There were huge challenges coming from inside the church and from the outside. And this gets to the great paradox of the time. The church was at the absolute peak of its power, but it was also incredibly fragile. For over 100 years, the papacy's leadership was an absolute mess. First, the popes just up and moved to Avignon in France, making them look like puppets of the French king. Then came the total disaster of the Great Schism. Can you imagine the confusion? You had 2, and for a while 3 different guys, all claiming to be the one true pope, all excommunicating each other? If you were just a regular person, how would you know who to follow? This chaos led directly to this dangerous new idea that a general council of the church, not the pope, should have the final say. Dissent was also bubbling up from below. In England, you had the Lollards, who were inspired by John Wycliffe. They challenged the church's wealth and wanted the Bible in English, but they never got enough political support from the powerful, so they were eventually crushed and forced underground. But over in Bohemia, the followers of Jan Hus, that was a totally different story. They got protection from powerful nobles and grew into a national movement that successfully rebelled against Rome. The Hussites sent a shocking message across Europe. Breaking with Rome wasn't just thinkable, it was doable. And at the very same time, you've got kings and princes who are starting to flex their muscles. And nothing, I mean nothing, captures this shift better than this brutally honest statement from a German prince, Albrecht of Brandenburg. He's talking about a local bishop, and he's basically saying, look, I don't care who the bishop is, because he works for me. The message is clear. A churchman's loyalty is to his local ruler first, not to some faraway pope in Rome. And it wasn't just the princes. You had powerful, rich cities like Nuremberg that were systematically taking control of their own religious life. First, they got legal exemptions from the bishop's court. Then, they put their own guys in charge of the city's monasteries. And finally, they just bought the right to hire their own priests for their main churches. They were essentially creating city-run churches, long before anyone had even heard the word Protestant. So, where does all this leave us? We're looking at a world that is just full of contradictions, a system that's at the absolute height of its power, but is also groaning under its own weight and its own complexity. And this right here is the central paradox. The popular devotion was absolutely real. The power was immense. People poured their money, their fears, their deepest hopes into this system. But at the exact same time, it was incredibly fragile. Its leadership had been compromised. Powerful rulers were chipping away at its authority. And the very ideas about salvation that fueled the whole thing were starting to be questioned. The old church was like a massive, beautiful arch, held up by those 2 mighty pillars, the Mass and the papacy. But the ground underneath was shifting. The pillars themselves had cracks running all through them. The whole structure was groaning, just waiting for one final tremor to hit. The only question left was what or who would finally be strong enough to bring the whole thing crashing down.